South Africa has confirmed that current boss Sir Richard Glover will vacate his position as CEO at the end of the year. Glover's control at the Federation stretches from late 2016, and he says he will not renew his contract to the tennis governing body. To speak more about this, Glover now joins us via Zoom. Good morning to you, Richard. So the obvious question is, so what has brought this about then? Your hanging up your tennis racket, as it were, by the end of the year.
Yeah, good morning, Jeffrey. Thanks for having me on. So I think a number of people have actually asked me in the last 24 hours, why leave now? Why leave when tennis seems to be on an upwards and positive trajectory? And I think there's that old saying, quit while you're ahead. And I think I've been very proud of the progress that the TSA team has made in the past few years. But the reality is that tennis in South Africa still has a very long journey ahead of it. There's still so much to do in all areas of tennis. And I think as a leader, you need to be brutally honest with yourself at all times, and you can't let ego get in the way. And I did need to ask myself, if considering this long and difficult journey ahead, if I was the right person to take TSA to the next stage. And I came to the conclusion that it was probably time for a new leader with fresh skills, as I say, to take Tennis South Africa to the next level. I think sometimes sports administrators overstay their welcome and cling on past their sell-by dates, and I never wanted to do that. I wanted to leave with some goodwill towards me remaining with the tennis community, and so this feels like the natural end of my time. At the end of 2021, I'll have been in the job for 5 years, and that feels like a good innings for me.
Now, you've become so entrenched at this organisation over the years. What will you miss most from your time there?
Yeah, so when I started at Tennis South Africa, I mean, I didn't come from a tennis background. I mean, I'd obviously worked in sport, but mainly team sports. And I think it was fascinating to come into an individual sport, which has very much obviously an individual sports culture. And it's a very, very different culture to a team sport culture or team sports environment. I think people tend to be much more individualistic and probably more strongly opinionated. And in a way, that was probably difficult in the early days to get around, the fact that everyone had an opinion on how I was doing my job. But in a funny kind of way, it's also something that I'll probably miss, in that tennis people are very articulate, are very intelligent, are highly opinionated, and they'll never let you rest on your laurels. Just when you think you're doing well and you're ahead of the game, someone will always have a comment or something to say. And I think in many ways, that's a healthy thing. And that's definitely something that I'll miss, the people, very much the people.
I know it's virtually impossible, but can you narrow down some of your highs and lows in your time at Tennis South Africa?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's always a tricky one, especially in such a short interview, because you can't cover everything. I think some of the things that I'm proud of are the fact that we've obviously put the federation, so the team, myself and the team around me, have put the federation in a solid place financially. We've obviously increased turnover dramatically in the last few years. We've obviously started to bring more international tournaments to South Africa, and we've invested in a lot of grassroots initiatives over the last few years. I think we've sown some seeds on some very fertile ground, and I'm really excited to see how some of those grassroots initiatives, to grow roots and grow into big trees. So that's something that I'm really excited about. I think in terms of disappointments, that's always a tricky one. But I can think of sort of lots of individual decisions and moments where maybe I could have done better or acted better in the moment or made better decisions. But there are probably too many of those to dwell on. But I think maybe one of my biggest struggles during my time at Tennis South Africa, and I think in some ways it's a struggle that many CEOs of South African sports federations have, is really trying to balance the competing demands of grassroots sport versus high-performance sport. So if you look at sports federations in this country, if you sort of strip them down and distill them to their essence, they have two key focuses. One is on growing the grassroots, and one is on producing high-performance athletes. And it's quite difficult within the current South African sports federation structures to actually try and balance those two competing demands. I think you almost need to be focused on one or focused on the other to really drive real change. And in some ways, it's actually a structural issue in South African sports. I think in many ways, this very issue means we're at the crossroads of our sport. And I do think it's probably time for a fundamental reimagining of the sports landscape in South Africa, because of my own first-hand experience of trying to balance those competing demands.
That was quite a mouthful. When you took over, you inherited a certain scenario within Tennis South Africa. What are you most proud of, and what will be different now with your departure for whoever comes in to take on the journey?
I think we've built a really good team at Tennis South Africa. So I'm talking about the office, I think the provincial volunteers we've got across the country, and of course the Tennis South Africa board as well. So I think that's a really good structure. I think we've built some good programs. I think we've brought in some really good sponsors who've stayed with us over the last 3 or 4 or 5 years. So that gives us a strong financial footing. Earlier this year, we announced quite a big broadcasting deal with the SABC, which is critical because for a sport like tennis, it needs to be on free-to-air channel and it needs to be reaching as many South Africans as possible. So I think my successor has really got a really strong base from which to work. But I think they've also got a lot of hard work on their hands because, let's be honest, tennis has reached a certain level over the last few years, but it really needs to go onwards and upwards. It's got a lot more work to do to really be a sport that all South Africans love and want to play.
Thanks so much for your time and your efforts over the last 4 and a bit years. That was Tennis South Africa's outgoing CEO, Richard Glover, with giving us some feedback on his time within the organisation.